I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. What was that? That is not the version we're familiar with. And the Pledge of Allegiance, the original Pledge of Allegiance was written in 1892, but it has changed drastically over its history and over our history. And it's changed and shaped our history. The Pledge of Allegiance really represents our national pride as well as reflects our national anxiety. And that's going to make a great deal more sense when I finish the rest of this presentation. But if you're interested to know why it was written, when it was written, how it's changed, why it's changed, please stay with us and I will explain all of that. The number one event, even though it's a long event, that changes and sets the stage for the Pledge of Allegiance is U.S. immigration. And I'm just going to give you a nutshell of the early part. Typically, the immigrants that come before the Civil War are called the old immigrants. I'm going to say a couple things about them. The immigrants that come after the Civil War are oftentimes deemed new immigrants. And so the contrast between old immigrants and new immigrants are as follows. In the original part of America all the way through to the Civil War, the vast majority of immigrants came from North and West Europe. The British Isles being the main area that they came. Most of the people who came in those years were Protestant. That is somewhat important because one can say by 1860 that the United States was a white, sometimes Anglo-Saxon, Protestant nation. It's where that phrase WASP comes from, if you've ever heard that. From the Civil War on, however, in large part because of industrialization, both here and over in Northwest Europe, industrialization was growing, the standard of living was growing and improving, and less immigrants from Northwest Europe came, and now they came from primarily Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, parts of Russia. And the biggest reason for that is if the standard of living is good in your country, you tend not to leave your country. If the standard of living is very bad and low and you want opportunities someplace else, that's one of the reasons the U.S. attracts so many immigrants in history, because it is a land of opportunity. So the immigrants that come now from Southern and Eastern Europe, primarily they're different, not only ethnically in culture and other ways like that, but they're very different in religion because the Southern Europeans were predominantly Catholic Christian. The Eastern Europeans, especially the people from the Balkans, were Eastern Orthodox Christian. And then the peoples that came, especially after 1881 from Russia, were Jewish. And so there was this flood of new immigrants coming in from the 1870s, especially 1880s and into the 1890s. Just a flood of people that did not quite have the same ethnic interests and priorities. They didn't have the same religious priorities. And America felt somewhat threatened. We did not want America to change. When I say we, meaning the Americans at the time, did not want to see America change, and they were worried about the people coming in. And it's not that different than it is today. There is still anxiety about immigrants coming in from Muslim countries or Mexico or Central America, even now. So that anxiety has not disappeared. That's why I say the Pledge of Allegiance really reflects that reality of American history. So what happened in the 1890s that gave us the Pledge of Allegiance is that there was this fear that America was changing and that we wouldn't stay together. And we wanted to have a renewal of the pride in America. So a man by the name of Balch wrote a pledge in 1887, just 5 years before the pledge that we know. And I'm going to read that to you now. And I just want you to take a look at it and just contrast it with what we have. This is how it read. We give our heads and hearts to God and our country. One country, one language, one flag. Again, that was written in 1887. Just 5 years later, the United States was still experiencing this flood of all these new immigrants. And so the managing editor of the Youth's Companion, one of the most popular magazines at the time, started a drive not only to get a pledge written, but to get flags everywhere, especially at every school. And so there was a drive, an advertising drive, a push for sales of flags in America to get flags out in homes, and especially one flag to every school. Some soldiers, old veterans, would go to schools and award flags to the student body of schools, and then they would put it up on the flag post, and that was a very big drive. Part of that drive was focused then on an event. It turns out in 1892, the editor of this magazine said, let's use the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America to be the event that we use to celebrate this regeneration of our patriotism. So there were songs and parades and lots of flags, and then Francis Bellamy, a former minister, was hired in 1892 to write the pledge. He writes the original that year. It is 22 words long. He'll change it to 23 words almost immediately because he left out a phrase, and you saw me say that pledge with the salute. It is interesting to note that Balch's pledge had the salute with the palm up too, and that Francis Bellamy's pledge just adopted that same salute. We don't change that for a long, long time. The pledge as it was written by Francis Bellamy originally then read, I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. That same moment that he wrote that, he just scribbled out a couple of words and added to the republic. So it now would say, I pledge allegiance to my flag and to the republic. And those are the 23 words most of us perceive to be the original pledge. And it would stay that way from 1892 all the way until 1923-24. Okay, so what did America look like in 1892? What were people going through in 1892 in America? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break groups up. If we talk about Native Americans, they were not having a very good time in America. There were lots of reservations by that time in history. The last significant massacre of Indians took place in Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. In that same decade of the 1890s, Oklahoma, which was reserved as an Indian reservation basically for several tribes of Indians, was set up, in which the government finagled some things to take some of that land and reapportion it and make some of it available to white settlement. And in the 1890s, Oklahoma was opened to settlement, and people ran in, literally ran into Oklahoma and staked a claim to sections of Oklahoma that were no longer reserved specifically for Indians, Native Americans. So not a very good picture. When we talk about blacks in America in the 1890s, by 1890, a full 90% of all blacks in the United States lived in the South. And unfortunately, things were not all that very good for blacks in America. Lynching was still very commonplace and would be commonplace for years and years to come. And segregation was becoming more and more institutionalized, if you will. There were blacks up north, and they were oftentimes segregated, but the numbers were just not significant, proportional to the population of whites. But in the South, segregation became more and more pronounced in these years. Jim Crow laws were put in force that would also take away much of the vote of many of the blacks who lived there. And segregation had its Supreme Court victory, if you will, in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson, which actually said separate was equal, and segregation really became fully institutionalized from that point on. That would not be overturned until 1954. Then in regards to farmers, of course, lots of people were farmers, but commodity prices were really down, and farmers didn't have that much vocal representation and support in the government. So farmers were struggling totally. In the side of business, industry and things like that, that was booming. And people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, and a banker named J.P. Morgan were very critically important people, very wealthy, influential people, and wielded lots of power in their industry fields. Workers working for them, however, did not flourish as well. Workers did not have very many rights. Hours were very long, benefits almost non-existent. Workmen's compensation didn't even exist. If you lost a limb in an accident, you got your limb back and then you lost your job. So workers started striking in large numbers from about 1877 into the 1890s. Strikers were looked upon as radicals. Oftentimes they were socialists and they were called socialists. But workers were fighting for some rights and some privileges because it was just really hard. Really, really, really hard. And to piggyback on that, blacks who wanted to join unions, which again were considered very radical at the time, most unions were racist. And so very many blacks were not allowed to join the unions and fight for their rights as workers. Tragic reality. Women in the United States did not have the vote, would not have it until 1920. I mentioned electricity early on just so that you could see how late in history we get electricity. And in rural areas of America, they didn't get electricity for a much longer period of time. So women's work was never done. There was a lot of drudgery for women in America, and they did not have the vote until 1920. So the last group I want to really address now is Asians, and a little bit about colonialism at the time in U.S. history and in world history. So what I want to mention is Darwin wrote a book in 1859 called The Origin of Species, and it is the beginning of the theory of evolution. But by the 1880s, that theory had kind of piggybacked on what was going on in the world, and there was something called social Darwinism that had kind of come about. And that social Darwinism was sort of an explanation for why light-skinned people were better and stronger and just altogether superior to dark-skinned people. Of course, I don't believe that at all, but it's important in the context because, again, as I go through these last couple of events, social Darwinism was a philosophy that did exist in the world, not just in America, about the racial differences in the world and why they were the way they were. Well, in the case of Asians in American history, and much of it is, of course, focused on the East and moving west, once we got California and once gold was discovered, some other people saw an opportunity in America, and those were the Chinese. And so from roughly 1850 on until 1882, the Chinese came over. They were instrumental in building the Western railroads. They were instrumental in doing several things in the camps, the gold camps. And so they came over and came over and came over for those 30 years. But the reason that matters in our story is they were not that welcome. They did not look white. They did not, most of them wore their hair in like the ponytail behind them, and they were not Christian. And so they were not that welcome. And although we'll use you and you work really hard and you build that railroad, in 1882, 10 years before the pledge, we actually had our first American immigration exclusion law in 1882 where we said no more Chinese are allowed. You can stay here if you're already here, but we don't want any more of you. That was the first time America had done that. That same time, at 1882, and for the next several years, Africa, which had been explored a great deal on the coast, and of course the slave trade was very prevalent from 1500 to 1850, colonialism happened, imperialism happened in Africa, and by World War I, all of Africa had been conquered by the Europeans with two exceptions, Liberia and Ethiopia. So what they used to deem and call the scramble for Africa was taking place. And you can only imagine if you were a black in America thinking, gosh, maybe I'll go back to Africa because I don't have very many opportunities in America. that wouldn't work because there was not very many independent countries in Africa that you could go to. And then finally, the United States got very involved in Asia in a way because we fought a war. I know it's a little after my event, but 1898, we fought the Spanish-American War. We took over an island called Guam. We took over an island called Puerto Rico. We took over islands called the Philippines. And we fought a war in the Philippines to suppress the people of the Philippines and not give them independence and make them a colony of the United States. We also annexed Hawaii in 1898, which is a whole different event. The bottom line is we got involved in Asia, and in that involvement, once we stopped the Chinese, the Japanese started to fill the gap, if you will, left behind by No More Chinese. And then I'll show you what happens with the Japanese and our attitudes towards them a little bit later in the program. Right now, what we need to do, though, is get to why did the Pledge of Allegiance add the phrase and get rid of my flag and add the phrase, the flag of the United States of America. And that took place and happened because of World War I. And World War I is a fairly fast jump in this story. It happens in 1914 to 1918 in Europe. The United States was involved from 1917 to 1918 in World War I in Western Europe. And in that war, loyalty to America was paramount. The First Amendment, the right to assembly, was restricted. Protesters were either imprisoned or in some cases deported. We just did not have any room for people who had split loyalty. And one of the things that's interesting about the Pledge of Allegiance through World War I is we said my flag. And if you can try to imagine, if you're a German American, if you're an American that came from the lands of Austria-Hungary, you maybe still had a lot of loyalty and a lot of patronage and all that to the country you came from. And so that when you spoke my flag, maybe in your heart you didn't mean the flag of the United States of America. Maybe you meant the flag where you came from. Maybe the fatherland or the motherland, as you might have called it. And so in those years, 1917, 1918, loyalty was just, oh my gosh, crazy in America. And it is interesting to note, at this moment, 1917, 1918, 4 forts were built in the South that were given names of famous Confederates to say to the South, we want you part of us. We need your help. We want your loyalty to go fight in Europe and be Americans. And so that was done in 1917 and 1918 for 4 forts down south. And it wasn't to say the Confederacy was great. It wasn't to say those Confederates were great. It was to say the South, we need your help in this war. We need your loyalty in this war. And this is what we'll do to kind of placate you or to give you some honor in the way that you see honor. So that happened in 1917, 1918. After World War I, we had something called the Red Scare, where we were really, really against a new government that had come about in Russia. In Russia, they had become communist in 1917, and we had a tremendous backlash against that. And so in America, we actually did deport some people who didn't proclaim loyalty to America because they said they were communists or socialists. We had people lost their jobs, things like that. Everybody who was bad, not loyal, were either radicals, socialists, communists, or anarchists, and we just threw them all in a lump. And we were very, very, very strong in our loyal zest that we had in America. So when the war was over, we did a couple of interesting things. In 1923, we got rid of my flag, and we added the flag of the United States. In 1924, we realized we should be more specific, and so we added of America. So now it was, I pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to get rid of any gray zone, any possible leaning towards your old former country. And so we are specifically mentioning what flag and of what country so that there's no split loyalties. In 1924 as well, we did 2 things that were kind of ironic, given America at the time, one of which was we gave citizenship to the Native American. And then in 1924, we also went one step after the 1882 exclusion of Chinese. In 1924, we made a full exclusion of Japanese immigrants. And so the Japanese who had come could stay, but we wouldn't take any more. Japan actually had a national day of mourning because of that law. And you can see 17 years later, Pearl Harbor happens, and a very strong, virulent war in the Pacific. The law in 1924, of course, did not cause the war, but you can be rest assured the Japanese did not forget that we had done that to them. And they were very proud people. So I've mentioned the citizenship for the Native American, I've mentioned the Japanese, and in 1924 was when we formalized the United States of America in the Pledge. And we did one other thing that's really kind of important in the scheme of what we've talked about, and that is to do with immigration history. I've already said we said no more Japanese, but in Asia, in Europe, we actually restricted immigration and really limited the number of people who could come over from South and Eastern Europe. The people that were Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Jewish, America just felt at that time of xenophobia that we didn't want them anymore. So we largely restricted them. And then again, we said altogether no more Japanese. So that all happened. Now let's move into the 1930s and 40s so we can get to the story of the Under God addition to the pledge. In the 1930s, we had the Great Depression. It is interesting to note that the communist Soviet Union did not have a Great Depression during the 1930s. So there were certainly Americans who were wondering maybe if their system was better than ours, since the Depression was very, very, very hard time in America. And 1/4 of Americans that wanted a job didn't have a job. And that is a huge percentage, as you can reckon. And so there was a little bit of sympathy towards a little bit of the communist attitude out there. Not, hey, we love Stalin. There was not that, but there was just this recognition that the United States economy was broken, and we were very worried about it. I mention that because, of course, the Great Depression and lots of the other events that were taking place led to World War II. I want to say a couple of things about World War II because that also changed the pledge. And it also changed a couple other things in America that we think about today, but really didn't necessarily realize. So in World War II, we went to war with Japan after Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, when Germany declared war on us, we went to war with the Axis powers, and we fought against Germany, Italy, and Japan in a world war. We had to cross the Pacific, we had to cross the Atlantic, and our main allies were Britain and the Soviet Union. I mention that specifically because in my story, as I've said, there wasn't necessarily sympathy for communism in America, but in the 1930s, they didn't have a Great Depression, and in the 1940s, they helped us defeat Nazi Germany. And so there was certainly a few Americans who were like, maybe they're not all bad. I'm not suggesting for a moment they should have thought that way or shouldn't have thought that way. They just simply felt that way. And so in 1940s, though, if you remember, I mentioned that there were some forts built in the South in 1917 and 1918 that were named after famous Confederates. Well, in World War II, we wanted the South to be just as excited about fighting for America as they had in World War I. And so there were several more forts added to the military complex in America. And those military bases were oftentimes also named after famous Confederates. Again, not to say that the Confederates were great people. That is not why we did that. What we were saying is we need you, the South, to fight along with us as patriots, and we wanted to give them and placate them in some way to make them feel like we really were embracing them. That's really important. The other critical thing that happened in 1942, though, was that the flag changed its salute. It turned out that there was too much similarity to the way that we saluted the flag with our palm up and the Nazi salute And so in 1942, we formally got rid of that as the salute. We put our hand on our heart, and that's why we've done that ever since. When the war was over, we had the Cold War. And the Cold War was a contest between the Soviet ideology and the American ideology. And that is going to lead to the new change and the big change in the pledge with Under God. And I'm going to do a little bit about that. But as a segue, I also want to be sure that we're clear. In 1945, the Cold War started with the Soviet Union and the United States. The ideology differences economically and religiously were paramount. And specifically, I need to say something about Karl Marx, the founder of the communist ideology. He believed religion was like a pacifier in the mouth of people, and he did not want that in the fight for labor and peasants and the rights and taking from the rich and giving to the poor and splitting everything. He did not want religion to be part of the equation. So he was formally an atheist, and Soviet Union was formally atheist. And so in the 1950s, when the Cold War turned hot in Korea from 1950 to 53, we fought a war there. Americans lost over 33,000 lives in that war. We fought against the communist Chinese. We fought against communist weapons produced in the Soviet Union. It was definitely a communist versus non-communist war. And that war also got a lot of people anxious, worried, nervous about communism. A senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy started to suggest that maybe we had communists in our own ranks, maybe even in our government. And he started a movement called McCarthyism, which is a Red Scare from the 1920s that I talked about on steroids. And it was a huge movement. And that movement, without that movement, we wouldn't have Under God. And if it wasn't for the communist ideology that was atheistic, we wouldn't have Under God. But one other interesting thing that happened in 1954 to kind of get this going is in the 1950s and up through 1954, a Catholic organization called the Knights of Columbus started to push for adding God to the pledge. In early 1954, there was a pastor at a Presbyterian church that gave a sermon on Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And at the very end of that address, most people think that the address had a sentence that included the phrase "under God." And Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, was in the congregation on that day when that sermon was given. And Eisenhower was now sort of on board. The Knights of Columbus had been pushing for it. McCarthyism was red hot. And so the Congress passed in 1954 the law that said, or rather, the change in the flag code that added "under God." You now see the pledge as you're familiar with it. That's how it's been said ever since, with our hand on our heart saying that pledge. And that all took place in 1954. But to finish this up, 1954 had a couple of other events. In 1954, Ellis Island was closed as an immigrant port of entry. Indochina, French Indochina, was officially split into a North and a South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And that, of course, is the seed of some other events that we can do another chapter on another time. And also in 1954, there was a Supreme Court case. And that Supreme Court case was Brown versus Board of Education, which finally overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and said that separate was not equal. I want to finish by simply thanking you for coming. I want to finish by saying why I'm doing this. I am doing this because history provides perspective. Perspective protects and maintains truth and promotes empathy. That is the purpose of these and the future chapters. I want us to understand history better so that we understand our world better and our circumstances better. And I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope you'll come and visit again. Thank you so much, and goodbye.